Picture this, if you will. It's a small place in the north of England. It grew out of a selection of villages, one of which was found to be a large deposit of iron ore. An iron extraction industry grows out of that, and then finally, an industrial steelworks. The town grows. By the end of the 19th century, the town reaches 5 figures, and the demands of the First and then the Second World War grow its industrial community centered around the steelwork. While it does grow, this town does flounder by the 1970s. England is no longer an industrial heartland. England no longer needs its own raw materials for production. This is outsourced, and so too is the product in production there. The steel is outsourced to another place. The price goes too far, and it's difficult to justify the industry. This is the town that we find ourselves in when I was born. It's the late half of the 20th century. Britain is struggling as an industrial capacity, and so too does the North in many heartlands. The industry dies off or moves elsewhere, but luckily here it stays for a short time, bought out time and again. It's important to understand that, because the community that's left there is not one of middle-class situation. These are not people who live in the commonly rural area where this town is, but instead it attracts an industrial community, the salt-of-the-earth working class of the North. It's unusual, because in the county it's situated, this is not the norm. Much of this town is dominated by council estates. The council inherited these estates from the industrial heartland. Much of them are terraces, though many semi-detached, but nobody really wants to live in any of these. The community is rough and hard. Many do not know what to do with themselves. Industrial jobs move away. What little other industry that's in the town, whether that be clothing production or food packaging, is also moved away, outsourced to larger metropolitan areas. The town flounders. It's dominated by these huge industrial estates, but they're no longer housed by people who work in these hard jobs. In 1999, a Prime Minister is elected, and he brings in, with him, a series of rising dole payments, offerings to workers who no longer can find jobs in their area. This becomes a coffin nail for these communities. Most of the adults see it as a way of getting out of jobs that they hate. Finally, they can get out of these hateful office and service jobs and move possibly into something that they love. But they don't do that. Instead, they get trapped in other things. Drama in the community. Drugs. Crime. These estates are rough, and it rubs off on the people that live in them. Today I'm going to talk about my own experience living on these estates, and how the tragedy of the northern working class presents itself on the youth that are raised in there. My life already starts off unusually. My father gets a job in the USA. It's always been a dream of his to move there. My mother, despite being pregnant, decides to let him go, with no connection to herself. She moves in with her parents. Luckily, her parents are upper working class. Her father, smart and industrious, has worked his way up through an electrician's trade to become a draftsman, and then a designer of great electrical works. This has allowed him to create his own business, and given him a sizable income, which he uses to make himself comfortable. His wife is a learned woman. She works in public service. They both work, and they have 2 children, one of which is my mother. My mother didn't really take much from her own parents. At the age of 21, she got pregnant, and as I said, the man moved away. As we can already see, a stereotype here occurs. A northern working class lad who doesn't know his father. And this is endemic across the north. Many boys are born with a father who takes no responsibility. He's lucky if he knows who he is, and even then, most of the time he's a deadbeat who wants nothing to do with his past partner, nor those he sired from her. My mother makes many mistakes like this, which we'll see in repetition. Not soon after I was born, she then gets with another man who, in her infinite wisdom, also sires a child with her. He has nothing to do with this child, even now that that child is an adult. Later, she has a little stroke of luck. She meets a man who's more committable, more stable, salt-of-the-earth working-class man, working industry jobs. But he doesn't like the stepchildren. He sees them as figures of the men that she has already been with. He doesn't treat us well. He beats us when we're bad, and not well either. Not the nice kind of beating that teaches you to behave, but the kind that shows resentment. Mother doesn't like this, but she sticks out the marriage for some time, having a child with him. Eventually the relationship breaks down, and she moves to another man, a friend of a previous lover, who then she moves in with, kicking out the husband, for him to live on his own. This was before no-fault divorce, but the abuse was enough to get rid of him. The next man seems nice to the children. He's a bit weird, and he's also a drunk. While he works hard, he goes out and spends his money in the pub, and then comes back lathered. He doesn't hit my mother, but he's a terrible drunk anyway, causing scenes and arguments. Still, somehow, she also makes a child with this man, despite being out of wedlock. This child, at least, knows his father, and has consistent contact with him. Though the dad is still a drunk deadbeat, and blew up his pancreas later in his life due to his drinking habits, as is common with many Northern men, who turn to drink to cope with the life that they live. This is where life becomes a little more difficult and complicated. See, she has no husband to rely on anymore. She's moved away from the house that she lives in, and gone back to her previous lover, who she knew before my father. He's a little bit angry. He has some issues in controlling his temper, but he never really hits her. He fights with his older daughter from another relationship, and a son too, though he is younger. A little younger than me too. This relationship continues. His house is nice. He owns it himself. It's a semi-detached with a big garden, though the people around him are a little rough. Unfortunately, he's got a big mouth, an even bigger mouth when he's drunk. He goes out into the centre one day, runs off his mouth while he's drunk. Guys beat him up, and his brain is damaged. He spends many months in the hospital, and my mum coddles him a lot. She clearly loves him, and is struggling with it. She eventually agrees to marry him, although this is a mistake. He's no longer the man that she loves, but somebody different. His temper's worse. The marriage doesn't last. Eventually one day, she comes home, and he struggles with his temper. Breaks a finger. He's forced to leave and live with his mum. He still suffers from brain damage. He still has a hard time working his way around society, and he still lives with his mum. Problem now is, we live in his house. What will we do? Mum's put on the council register, and she waits until they can provide a house for us. We've already lived on one of the council estates with the first husband. Now we move to another one, a rougher one. The kids around here are horrible, to me and to my mother, but she falls in with a crowd, another single mum, and a couple of guys in the area, known to deal drugs. One of the guys did steal her car, even though he knew my mum, and my mum knew that he stole it. Later this guy hangs himself. Sad story, but very common in the north. School life is horrible, and I hate it. And I hate myself. Kids bully me because of my hair colour. Common in England, especially in northern communities. The second of us, the brother younger to me, he falls in with these kids, and it'll affect him later, which I'll try and bring up if I remember, though this story is about me. I fall in and meet another friend, one who I knew in the past, though we become very close. Same kind of situation as me. His mum's single. She lives on the dole. He has 2 older brothers, but they're all from the same father. Another deadbeat, who moved away and didn't want to take responsibility. Mum, despite struggling as a single parent, still meets with many men, and it disrupts our relationship with older men. We don't really know if they're sticking around or not. Some of them fall in with drugs, and a friend at the time also. It starts with weed, and it gets worse. I remember once, very vividly, writing a letter to my mother and placing it on the mantelpiece, describing how I knew that her drug habit was killing her and ruining her, and she would not be a capable mother for us. Such foreshadowing, but I didn't let her read it. I took it away and tore it up before she ever got a hold of it. Another time, in the same house, go across road as a child, phone call for my mother, but she's not in, she's at a friend's house. I run across road, but naively I leave the door open. Come back and find laptop is gone. Rush out of door and find man walking down street with my laptop. I rush up to him and take it away from him. A bravery that I could never imagine a child showing now as an adult. But he didn't try to stop me. He was known in the area, as is common on most working class northern estates. The thieves are known, and you thieve from the people that you know. Scum, but you have to tolerate them. Eventually, my mum meets a decent guy. He's already been in a relationship before, and he's also divorced. He has 3 other children, but they live with him and not with her. We get good together. We make friends with his kids. My mum clearly loves him. But there are problems, and they become evident fairly quickly. The arguing and the fighting from other relationships overhangs, and she knows it. She fights with me and with him, but she fights with me worse. Pulls my hair, punches me, kicks me, but I give as good as I get, and sometimes I think I deserved it. I was not a good teenager. Although unlike most, I never fell in with gangs or with drugs. I was an angry kid, full of nihilism and hate, and it showed. Eventually, she does marry this guy, and they get on well together. They plan a child, but have a miscarriage, so they try again. This child is successful, and he is my 5th and final brother. I love them all to pieces, and our friendship and bond is much closer than any I would ever develop in my later life. This relationship, although, still falls apart, despite there being a child involved. Eventually his other children are taken, the state decides to give them back to the mother, and he's resentful of that. The stress between them gathers, and I blame my mother for that, though whether that's true, it could be young naivety. My mum tries to move out, go somewhere else, just like before, but she's homeless now, so she moves back in with her friend. But it's different for me this time though. I'm older, I can make my own decisions. Not yet of age of consent, but close. And I decide, no mum, I'm staying with him. It lasts for a few weeks and we have a good bond. I always bonded better with older men than I did women. Problem here though is, I wasn't allowed to stay. Eventually I move into my grandparents, as I mentioned before, and here are where many of my mannerisms and outlooks on life come from. My love of history, my love of tradition, my critical mind, my politeness and manners, and my accent too, sounding northern, but a little bit unroughened. School is still shit though. People treat me like crap because of my hair colour. People treat me because I hang out with nerds. I'm not very sociable. Life's been hard and I don't bond with people well, and so that shows in my friendships. Many of my friends were friendships of convenience to stop the loneliness, and later when I realised we had little in common, we moved away again. Mum lives as technically homeless for a few more weeks, and she lives with one of her friends, the druggie that we mentioned before. That doesn't last too long though. Eventually the council finds us another house, this time on one of the worst council estates in the whole of the town. This one is very rough. The neighbours, despite trying to be friendly, flip sometimes, hating each other, especially the second brother, who's known to fall in with bad crowds. He gets involved with the local gangs, and a wrong action here, a wrong word there, a bad thought, and they turn on him, and turn on my mother. They start harassing us, throwing stuff at the door, gathering outside, threatening us, harassing us even more, to the point where my mother cracks. She tells them to leave and go away, and the neighbour smacks her. Finally the council decides to step in, and we get moved out finally, after a year and a half of total misery, surrounded by the worst kind of people you could imagine. During this time at high school is when I realised that my class reflects on some people more than me personally. I have a good friend, and we have much in common. Usual things that boys like then. Armies, guns, video games, cars. I go round to his house a few times, and his dad treats me with such contempt, and I don't know why. Try to change to make myself better to him, but none of this will work. He hates me because I'm working class, or even worse, I'm the dole class, and he doesn't like me. He thinks I have a bad influence on his son, bad language, rough accent, rougher values. But he doesn't realise that I'm the one that kicks that trend. But this whole experience taints my future visions of the middle class and how to treat them. The council, being desperate, moved us finally to a private rent in a small rural town outside of the place of my birth, much smaller, maybe even less than a tenth of the size. Beautiful, tight-lit, mural community, but with some council estates attached for those who don't want to live in the main urban centre. It's beautiful, it's farming, and it was nice and relaxing. Finally, no tensions between the neighbours, no scum harassing us or knocking on the door, and no more expected violence. But the relationship with my mum gets worse. I'm a teenager. I don't like her anymore. I resent her for the decisions that she's made up until this point. All of the poor decisions that have made our life chaos. Until this point, we've now moved houses nearly 9 or 10 times, and I'm barely even 18. Stability is not a thing I know. People come and go, relationships are passing, and it's difficult to make friends when you're moving around all the time. We fight, a lot, and sometimes it results in hitting and punching, which eventually has me arrested by the police. Not formally, but they cuff me and take me away to my grandparents. This wouldn't be the last time. Countless others, of which the last one I walked the 20-mile stretch to get back to my friend's house, who lived in the middle of the urban centre. She was always resentful, and it became a habit of never apologising for anything. A terrible thing that I'd have to get out of in later life. The drugs were still there, but lesser. More of a coat to deal with the stress and purposeless. She hasn't worked now since my third brother was born, nearly 12 years ago, and she would never return to work. Even now she languishes on the dole, purposeless, and her mental health eats at her and drags her into the darkness. It's around this time as well that my father tries to get back in contact with me. I've seen him a handful of times across my youth, but it's always been awkward. Like a guy who visits, that I should have a relationship with but don't. A ghost of a connection. It's more like talking to an older friend, one that I really don't know, and we have nothing in common with. He's not my dad. He's just a father, a sperm donor, and I find it's hard to deal with him even now. I'll leave this tale here for now. It's one of tragedy and struggle, but when you live it you don't realise that. Both me and my third brother, the one who am I closest to, we both have spouses now, and when they talk about our lives, they see the tragedy and the danger and the destruction that was caused by it. But we don't realise that. For us it's the norm, it's what we had to live with, and it's what we did live with. Despite the constant interjection of the authorities into our lives, no one came to save us, and we still struggle with it, even today. Do not feel sympathy or sorrow, but learn from this tale, and deign never to repeat it again. That's all for now. 再见.